give the floor to Mr. Ibrahim. Thank you. Friends of the media. Today, on behalf of the Committee on Members' Interests, I address the Council on the report on complaints against Mr. Alan Leung, Ms. Claudia Mo, and Mr. James To. And the report of the Committee on Members' Interests actually took me 20 minutes to read out in the Council today, so I won't repeat the content. I will just recap the gist of the conclusion. In relation to Mr. Alan Leung's complaint, the committee's conclusion is that we accept Mr. Leung's explanations. We consider that there is no information to show that Mr. Leung had breached Rule 83(3) of the Rules of Procedure on the following matters. And the following matters means failure to register within 14 days from the receipt of a donation of $300,000 from Mr. Jimmy Lai in June 2013 as an interest of financial sponsorships as provided in Rule 83(5)(d)(2). So the committee's conclusion is that the complaints against Mr. Alan Leung for having breached the registration requirement under Rule 83(3) of the ROP were not substantiated. And that's the unequivocal conclusion. As for Ms. Claudia Mo's complaints, the CMI's conclusion is this. After examining the information provided by Ms. Claudia Mo, the CMI considers that there is no information to show that Ms. Mo had breached Rule 83(1) of the ROP for the following matters, and that is for failure to register not later than the first meeting of the 5th LegCo on the 10th of October 2012, a donation of $500,000 allegedly received from Mr. Jimmy Lai Chi Ying in April 2012 as an interest of election donations as provided in Rule 83(5)(d)(1). So the CMI's conclusion is that the complaints against Ms. Claudia Mo for having breached the registration requirement under Rule 83(1) of the ROP were not substantiated. So these two conclusions are clear. In relation to Mr. James To's case, the conclusion is this. As members of the CMI hold divergent views on the complaints and that the CMI could not form an opinion on the complaints, the CMI would not follow up Mr. James To's complaints further. However, should new evidence or information be received by the CMI, then as usual, the CMI would consider, according to stringent procedures, on how to follow up on the complaints. And this is the gist of today's report. So I'll see if you have any questions on our report. Deputy Chairman and myself will be happy to take your questions. For English media, you may also have questions. So please let them ask the questions first. Please pass them the microphone. State your name and the media organization. Yang On K from Cable TV. Well, I'd like to ask about Mr. James To. Now the complaint was not substantiated. I mean, the complaint is vetoed. Is it the case that the complaint was not substantiated or that there was no conclusion? Why did the committee decide not to follow up on his case? Well, that question was also asked by many reporters just now. We had procedures as far as the CMI is concerned, and we need to follow the procedures. On receiving a complaint, we would consider whether the complaint should be taken on. For example, whether the complaint complainant is anonymous or whether this is a named complainant, and also whether the subject of a complaint is a serving member of the council. So if these conditions are met, we will take on the complaint for further consideration. And then we'll move on to the preliminary consideration stage. And you can see we have taken quite a long time in the preliminary consideration stage. And if further consideration is required, we'll move on to the investigation stage. So we're exactly at this stage. We've completed the preliminary consideration stage. For the matter voted on, you could see that we follow Rule 12. Rule 12 or Para 12 of the procedure is this. If the committee believes that the complaint is not substantiated, the committee may decide not to follow up on the complaint by way of the investigation stage. That is to say, if at the preliminary consideration stage there is a clear voting result that the committee that the complaint should not be substantiated, then it will not we will not proceed to the investigation stage. However, if the complaint is voted against, meaning that it is not substantiated, then we will move on to Para 12 of the procedure. That is, it should move on to the investigation stage. That is, if members voted against the decision of the complaint not being substantiated, and I exercise my power as chairman to cast I exercise my casting vote to vote against the question, so that we could move on to discuss whether we should proceed to the investigation stage. And as you can see in the report, the matter was then voted on. That is, whether CMI should proceed to the investigation stage. And 3 members voted for, 3 members voted against it. The result was 3-3, and then I exercised my casting vote to vote against the question. So in the end, we decided not to proceed to the investigation stage. So in the end, the conclusion is, as I said just now, because we hold divergent views on the complaints, the result is as the version I read out just now. So to be more accurate, let me read it out again. Members of CMI hold divergent views on the complaints, and CMI could not form an opinion on the complaints and therefore would not follow up further in relation to Mr. James To's case.
No.
Chairman, I'd like to ask James To, Claudia Mo, and Alan Leung. They had provided documents to the CMI to prove that they did not receive funds. So why would the CMI have to cast a vote and whether they had to have a follow-up investigation, and why would an investigation be launched based on what the comments they made in a talk show? Well, Mr. Alan Leung and Claudia Mo, in our preliminary stage, we had come to a conclusion. At the time, the indication was that in fact, we should call it a decision, was that it was not substantiated, and we had already taken that step. Now, since it was not substantiated, we therefore did not move into the investigation stage, and we announced the result. In James To's case, it's because the votes for and against were exactly the same. So those who agreed, we already stated in our paragraph, so if you have the opportunity to review Do you have a copy of my speech? You do? In my speech, I have already stated what the reasons were. And put simply, it's because some members felt that the information could not fully explain the questions, especially Mr. Jimmy Lai. Mr. Jimmy Lai's document could not give a full explanation, and therefore you cannot say it was unsubstantiated. But then some members, 3 members, felt that the relevant information was already sufficient, and there was nothing else that could give doubt to the point that there were more financial sponsorships from Mr. Jimmy Lai. Let me supplement. Actually, if you look at the different members, they provided information such as bank statements, deposits, and so on. In the first 2 cases, we felt that more or less it was okay, there was no problem. But in the 3rd case, there was an internet radio show and comments were made, and some people felt that Mr. Lai, his statements were in contradiction with each other, and we tried to clarify that. But as you can read from the chairman's speech, Mr. James To said that there was a legal investigation ongoing and was not concluded. Therefore, he had sought legal opinion, and after such opinion, he felt that it was not appropriate to contact Mr. Lai on this issue. So he could not ask him to provide further proof. So some members felt that, well, that is not appropriate. There should be an investigation. Some people said no. We felt that it was already proved. There was no receipt of funds. So that's why, as our chairman said, we had cast a vote. It was 3 against 3. And therefore he had to cast the deciding vote, an objection. Commercial radio, I'd like to ask on this occasion regarding Mr. James To, you had cast the vote on 2 issues. First, there was the vote on Mr. James To's case not being substantiated. The vote was 4 against 3. So could you say that is equivalent to saying that Mr. James To's case was substantiated? Let's answer this question first. Well, since we did not enter the investigation stage was vetoed, so the CMI could not come to a decision. So that is the response. So we cannot put it as the way you said it. So that is that voting result, is that equivalent to saying that his case was substantiated or not substantiated? No, well, it's because the CMI did not enter investigation, so there was no conclusion. But the vote regarding, is that a vote on not substantiating the case? Well, we now have 2 results, so does that lead to confusion? You don't agree that he's problem-free, but then, well, we were in the midst of the procedures and we had to go through that step. If it was not substantiated, then that would end the case. If it was substantiated, if we felt that there could be a further step, and then we would come to a decision. As I explained just now, that was the procedure. Regarding the designated procedures, it was ongoing. There might be some misunderstanding in the explanation. The vote was whether, if there was a decision, whether we would continue on to the investigation stage. If not, it was to decide whether we should go to the investigation. So if it were to continue, then we could collect more information and colleagues might express their views on that. But since we did not enter investigation, that is why our final decision was that we had divergent views, and therefore we could not come to a conclusion. So it is now up to the public to make up their own minds.
Can't hear you.
Hello. Would you agree that there are still lingering doubts about James To's case? And is there anything else your committee can do to follow it up?
Well, I think the chairman has explained what happened, and the two rounds of voting took place, and the report also said that some members want Mr. Lai to produce evidence to show that he did not make the donation. But Mr. To said after taking legal advice, he doesn't think it was right for him to contact Mr. Lai. So I guess so some members obviously feel that they want to hear from Mr. Lai. But some of us feel that if you look at the bank accounts and everything, there's no money being deposited. We think that it is quite clear that he has not taken the money. But if others feel that because Mr. Lai said two different things on two different occasions on the online program, so if that can be verified, maybe it will satisfy the other members. So as the chairman said at the last part of his speech, if there's fresh evidence or something that's being adduced in future, then maybe they will be satisfied that that the allegation is not substantiated.
係你好啊，咁其實都係。
Well, regarding the wording, I would like to seek some clarification. You're saying that it is not substantiated and it was vetoed. So it doesn't mean that it's unsubstantiated. So either it was substantiated or if there were divergent views and it was undecided. So regarding these two options, which is the case? Because we need to report whether it was unknown or unsubstantiated. We need a clear explanation. And if it is substantiated and unknown, why isn't an investigation conducted? So is it, Mr. Yip, you cast your vote and therefore you would not, an investigation was not conducted? We would like a clear answer. The reason for my vote is already explained in my report. You can refer to the report because under rules of procedure, I need to follow 79A to cast the vote. So if we cannot have more than 50% support, I have to cast a objecting vote. It doesn't mean that I don't have the opportunity to express my own view. So you also mentioned the vote result, and whether it was unsubstantiated and what that meant. Well, I can only say that it's because we could not enter the investigation stage, so we could not come to a conclusion. That was our conclusion. Why is that? Why is it that we could not enter investigation? It's because there were 3 members who wanted to investigate and 3 thought that we should not investigate. So I could only follow Rule 79A, the requirement. I could only object. I cannot side with. I cannot take sides. So these are the rules of procedure requirements, and I cannot breach these arrangements. So that is the conclusion.
A number of questions. The question was whether the complaints against Mr. James To were not substantiated. About the phrasing of the question, is it in accordance with the ROP or was it decided by you as chairman? Why don't you ask your questions one by one? This is in accordance with the with Rule 11 of the procedure for the CMI. That is, we must vote on whether the complaints were substantiated. Whether the complaints were substantiated. But why is it that in paragraph 4.20 it says whether the complaints were not substantiated? Well, because it says in paragraph 11 that if the complaints were not substantiated, we should not proceed to the investigation stage. So the question was whether the complaints were not substantiated, and we voted on that. But you read para 12 and para 11 of the procedure just now. Para 12, that is to say, the CMI can decide not to proceed to the investigation stage if it is of the view of the committee that the complaint is not substantiated. So we should follow this paragraph and frame the question as to whether the complaints were not substantiated in order to decide whether to proceed to the investigation stage. Another question. The committee received complaints in relation to 5 members, but this report only relates to 3 of them. For the remaining 2 members, is it because you have decided that there should be investigation? And witnesses may be summoned. According to media reports, including Mr. Jimmy Lai, I want to know whether the information is true, and if so, whether the hearing be conducted in public or not. Well, for the 3 members, we have already made decisions on their complaints, and during the preliminary consideration stage, we have issued this report, and that the matters in relation to these 3 members are concluded here. It will not proceed to investigation stage. As for the remaining 2 members, we will proceed with investigation. As for how investigation is to be conducted, whether witnesses will be summoned, well, in fact, the committee under the Electoral Powers and Privileges Ordinance can invite witnesses or related persons to give evidence by way of a summons. We can, on the other hand, invite them to come. So I'm saying that we're going to invite persons related to this case to accept further investigation by the committee. So, according to the ROP, the investigation would be conducted by way of a closed-door hearing, unless with the subject's consent. From TVB, 3 questions for you, Chairman. First question about Mr. James To. You exercised your casting vote, but you also said that you just followed the procedure in casting your vote. What is the justification? Why is it that you found this problematic and yet no investigation will be conducted? Are you letting him off? My decision is based on Rule 79A1, and I reiterated just now that I should not exercise the vote in such a way as to produce a majority vote in favor of the question put. This is what Rule 79A1 of the ROP is about. This is how I exercise my casting vote. It's not my personal inclination whether I should vote for or against the question. I just follow the ROP as chairman. So is it because of this rule that even though you also found Mr. James To problematic, you let him off? I will not express my personal view because I am in the capacity of chairman of the CMI. Let her finish her questions. 3 questions, right? Another question about Mr. Alan Lau. Is it the case? He acted as a trustee. Has it been confirmed that he never pocketed any money? And as for Ms. Claudia Mo, before the election, she received the money but did not register her interest. So will the committee amend the procedures and so as to make things clear? As for Mr. Alan Leung's case, things are very clear. He gave us information, and we had this impression that he acted as a trustee. He also provided information relating to the account. As for donation given to Ms. Claudia Mo, her case is related to election donations, not the failure to register members' interests in her personal capacity. As a member of the Legislative Council, after receiving personal donations, within 14 days, the member is required to register the interest, and it is not the same as election donations. Back then, Ms. Claudia Mo was not a member of LegCo, so the rules on registering personal interests did not apply. We are not going to investigate into that. We only looked into the allegation of election donations, and our requirement was that on the 10th of October 2012, when she was sworn in as member of the LegCo, she should declare the relevant election expenses, and she did so accordingly. As for the financial resources of the election expenses, she explained that her husband donated $500,000. In this regard, it is not within our purview to pursue whether this donation of $500,000 actually came from Mr. Jimmy Lai or somebody else. That's her allegation that her husband donated $500,000 to her. So on election donations, we find that Ms. Claudia Mo have not breached the registration requirements, so the complaints were not substantiated. Some questions about Mr. James To. Now, the conclusion is that the CMI holds divergent views, that the matter would want to follow up further. Would this create a loophole so that members can be let off? And is there any collusion involved? And about inviting Mr. Jimmy Lai to a hearing, has he replied? And when will the hearing be held? I can say, in relation to your first question, the CMI could only act within the procedures, CMI procedures. I think we can all make our personal judgment, and the public will, of course, make their own judgment after reading this report. On question 2, in relation to persons who will be invited to attend our hearing, as this will be a closed-door hearing, I can only say that the relevant individuals will be invited.
I'd like to respond to the question about being let off scot-free. No, it's not the case. We were complying with the rules. We looked at the information. But some members felt that they wanted more information, and we voted accordingly. So as the chairman said, those were the rules of the voting procedure. So it's not fair to describe that certain people will let off scot-free. We had looked at the information. We felt that there was no problem, but some people said no, we want to call witnesses again. But then we sought legal opinion, and we found that we could not seek further witnesses. So I think we should be fair in our description. So I think we have to let the public make up their own mind. Legislators had differing views. I could only say that within the CMI, we had divergent views. And regarding divergent views, the public and the media will have to decide for yourselves. From RTHK, I'd like to ask, regarding Mr. James To's case, the conclusion that you have now, you said that if you have further information in the future, you might have a further investigation. So if the law enforcement agencies in the future, if we have some new information, will you take the initiative and conduct your own investigation, or will you be passive and have to wait for other law enforcement agencies? So In the previous cases, Mr. Alan Leung and Claudia Mo's case, was it unanimous that there was no problem? So could you also tell us what the votes were? I'll answer the last question. It was unanimous, and we felt that those two cases were not substantiated. And your question about being proactive, well, we will never be proactive. We are always, we have to receive a complaint, and that complaint has to comply with the conditions I mentioned. They have to be serving legislators, or they had to have been legislators in the last 6 months, in the previous 6 months. We also have to have a complaint that is not anonymous. And if we have new information, you said other government departments might investigate. Well, I think that department, their outcome would be, if another government department were to come to a conclusion, it would be more shocking than our committee. Our conclusion was that we could only issue a warning, we could suspend the legislator, or suspend their powers and penalize them. And according to Rules of Procedure 73E, after submitting the report, we'd have to, the Legislative Council could deal with it. So that's the maximum we can do. So we will not be proactive. We have to wait for complaints, and we will comply strictly with the system and procedures. I'd also like to mention that our committee is made up of 7 people, and it's very clear that in this composition, so to put it in common terms, we have the pro-establishment camp, and we would have voting outcomes that might be 4 against 3, and we would also have voting outcomes of 3 against 3, and the way it is set up is that there would not be any bias, and we will deal with these issues in the strictest manner, and we have taken into account the minority views and majority views.
Where we see that the chairman actually had an extra vote because there's a 50-50 view in James' case, but the chairman's decision not to investigate into the case seems to be contradictory to his decision that James To's complaint is actually sustained and substantiated. So do you think that this is actually contradictory?
No, because the rules of procedure provide very clearly about this, how the chairman should cast his casting vote. And it applies not just to this committee, but to others, so that if there is no more than half support, the issue should stay open. So he could not just go and support it. So I don't think anybody would support changing that rule. This rule applies to all other committees as well.
But don't you think it's offering legislators an overprotection, because now we have 6 members in this committee and the chairman's vote actually doesn't count? So wherever you have this 50-50 situation.
Yeah, well, because the way the rules are written is that if you don't get more than half of the support, then you don't cast a vote in support. And I think this is quite usual in other parliaments as well. So if we want to change that, I think we have to do a lot of study to find out, you know, what is a good reason for changing it. Because if we change it, then we have all sorts of other problems as well. I mean,
I'm from Daigong Bo. In the radio program, Mr. Jimmy Lai had said that he had given Claudia Mo 500,000 as with Mr. James To. So why does Miss Claudia Mo's case not need an investigation? And I'd also like to ask, which people will you invite for a hearing? Have you issued an invitation? Regarding the first question, we had already explained that Mr. Lai, there were some reports that had made a description, and in the CMI, under the rules of the CMI, they need to make a declaration. They need to declare their election donations, and if they had disclosed election donations and said that they were funds for electioneering and it was declared, then the election committee can deal with it. And he already declared 500,000. But was it directly by Mr. Jimmy Lai or indirectly to Ms. Claudia Mo? We don't have the power to investigate. This is up to the election committee. We just look at whether there was a disclosure. So I have already explained this just now. And Mr. James To's case was different. He was a legislator, and if he had received other funds, he had to disclose that within 14 days. So that is a requirement of the second clause. So our second question was about an invitation. Now, since this was a meeting in camera, please understand that we cannot tell you who was invited, who was not invited. We will act upon the information, and up till now, we are just inviting the relevant parties to attend our hearing. So that is the situation up till now. And up till now, I cannot tell you who was invited, who wasn't invited, and whether they cooperated or not, and whether we would summon them to a hearing, even though we do have the power. I'd like to ask, you mentioned the rules of procedure just now, and whether the complaint was substantiated, you have to notify the legislator. So have you notified Mr. James To that his case was substantiated or not? So I just want to know how you will notify the person. Well, we have already notified the 3 legislators according to the conclusion that I read out to just now. And there was a divergent view in Mr. James To's case, and therefore we did not come to a conclusion, and we will not conduct further follow-up. We already told Mr. James To regarding the other 2 legislators. Actually, on each occasion, well, this is just a report, and after the meeting, I will make an announcement, and before the announcement, I have already notified the relevant legislator. We have complied with the requirements of the rules of procedure. Okay? Any other questions? Thank you.
幾耐話？呢個我哋講咗
乜嘢？
查咗幾耐？由去年7月。
It's in my speech, 23rd of July.
多謝啊。
唔該曬。